Wolf finds abandoned child. Crying on the road, and what happens next is incredible. The full moon dimly illuminated the forest of Yellowstone National Park, casting enigmatic shadows among the ancient trees. The night's silence was interrupted only by the soft whisper of wind through the leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Amidst this apparent calm, Jack Thompson, a 40-year-old park ranger, was conducting his usual night patrol. With a flashlight in hand and his faithful canine companion Rex by his side, Jack walked along familiar trails, his eyes alert for any signs of unusual activity. He had been working in the park for over 15 years and knew every corner of the forest like the back of his hand. However, on this night, something in the air felt different, as if nature itself was holding its breath, anticipating an extraordinary event. As he advanced along a dirt path that wound between the pines, Jack stopped abruptly. His ears, trained by years of experience, caught an out-of-place sound, a faint cry that seemed to come from the distance. He frowned, puzzled. Could it be an injured animal? Or maybe... No, it was impossible. No one in their right mind would be in the forest at this hour of the night, much less a child. However, Jack's instinct told him something wasn't right. With a silent gesture, he ordered Rex to stay still and strained his ear. There it was again, an unmistakably human sob. Without hesitating a second longer, Jack plunged into the thicket, guided by the sound. As he advanced, the crying became clearer. His heart was pounding, a mixture of anticipation and concern. Finally, as he rounded a bend in the path, his flashlight illuminated a scene that left him paralyzed with amazement. In the middle of the trail, curled up and shaking, was a small child. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old. He was wearing blue pajamas with rocket ship prints, now dirty and torn in some places. But the most shocking thing wasn't the presence of the child itself, but the company he had. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. Next to the little one, vigilant and protective, was a large wolf. Its silver-gray fur shimmered under the moonlight, and its amber eyes were closely watching the child. Jack held his breath, immediately recognizing the animal. It was the same wolf he had rescued years ago when it was just an orphaned cub. The wolf raised its gaze upon sensing Jack's presence. Their eyes met, and for a moment the ranger felt time stand still. In that gaze was recognition, trust, and something else. A silent plea. Jack took a cautious step forward, his mind racing to process the situation. The child, noticing his presence, lifted his head. His large brown eyes, swollen from crying, fixed on Jack with a mixture of fear and hope. "Hello, little one," Jack said softly, crouching slowly so as not to frighten the child or the wolf. "What's your name? What are you doing here alone?" The child only responded with more tears, hugging himself. The wolf moved, placing itself protectively between the child and Jack, but without showing signs of aggression. "It's okay, friend," Jack murmured to the wolf, extending a hand in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not going to hurt him. I'm here to help." As Jack assessed how to proceed, a noise in the nearby underbrush caught his attention. He quickly turned, illuminating the source of the sound with his flashlight. To his surprise and alarm, another wolf emerged from the bushes. This new animal was larger, and its posture was clearly aggressive, with bared teeth and a low growl resonating in its throat. In an instant, the situation became tense. The protective wolf stood on guard, placing itself between the newcomer and the child. Jack, his heart racing, prepared for the worst. He knew that intervening in a fight between wolves was extremely dangerous, but he couldn't risk the little one's life either. The two wolves began to circle each other, growling and showing their teeth. The child, terrified, curled up into a ball on the ground, sobbing silently. Jack, torn between protecting the child and not interfering in the animal conflict, maintained his position, ready to act if necessary. Suddenly, the aggressive wolf lunged at the child. In a split second, the protective wolf launched into attack, intercepting the other in mid-air. The two animals engaged in a fierce battle, a mixture of growls, bites, and swipes that broke the silence of the night. Jack took advantage of the distraction to approach the child. With quick but gentle movements, he took him in his arms. The little one clung to him instinctively, burying his face in the ranger's chest. "It's okay, little one," Jack whispered, gently stroking the child's back. "You're safe now." Meanwhile, the fight between the wolves continued. Jack watched, amazed by the ferocity and determination of the protective wolf. It was evident that it was defending the child with all its might. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the aggressive wolf retreated defeated. With a last growl of frustration, it disappeared into the darkness of the forest. The protective wolf, panting and with some minor wounds, approached Jack and the child. Its eyes, full of intelligence and concern, fixed on the little one. Jack, surprised by the animal's behavior, slowly crouched down, allowing the wolf to sniff the child, as if making sure he was okay. "Thank you, friend," Jack said to the wolf, with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. "You've been very brave." The wolf gently licked the child's hand before taking a few steps back. Jack understood the message. The animal trusted him to take care of the little one. "Come on, little guy," Jack said, standing up with the child in his arms. "I'll take you to a safe place. There we can figure out what happened and how to help you." As he walked away along the path, Jack looked back one last time. The wolf was still there, watching, like a silent guardian. At that moment, Jack knew that this night had been the beginning of something extraordinary, a story that would change his life and the child's forever. With his heart full of questions and a growing sense of responsibility, Jack headed towards the ranger cabin, aware that the mystery he had just discovered in the heart of the forest was only beginning to unfold. Dawn was painting the sky in pink and golden hues when Jack arrived at the ranger cabin with the child in his arms. The little one, exhausted by the traumatic experience, had fallen asleep during the journey, clinging tightly to the ranger's shirt as if afraid of being abandoned again. Careful not to wake the child, Jack entered the cabin and gently deposited him on the couch. He took a moment to observe him. The little one's angelic face contrasted with the dirt stains and dried tears on his cheeks. Who was this child? How had he ended up in the heart of the forest? And most intriguingly, what relationship did he have with the wolf that was protecting him? Jack shook his head, aware that these questions would have to wait. The first thing was to make sure the child was okay and contact the authorities. He picked up the phone and dialed his supervisor's number, Mike Sullivan. "Mike, it's Jack. We have an unusual situation," he began, glancing at the sleeping child. "I've found an abandoned child in the forest. I need you to come as soon as possible and bring a doctor with you." After hanging up, Jack approached the couch again. The child moved in his sleep, his face contorting in an expression of fear. Without thinking, Jack extended his hand and gently stroked the little one's hair, an instinctive gesture of comfort. To his surprise, the child visibly relaxed at the touch. While waiting, Jack busied himself preparing a light breakfast. The aroma of hot chocolate and freshly made toast began to fill the cabin. It was then that the child started to wake up, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar surroundings. "Good morning, little one," Jack said softly, approaching slowly so as not to frighten him. "Are you hungry?" The child sat up, looking around with big, scared eyes. When his gaze fell on Jack, he seemed to relax a bit, recognizing him from the night before. He nodded timidly in response to the question. "Come on, I've prepared something for you to eat," Jack said, extending his hand. To his surprise, the child took it without hesitation, allowing himself to be guided to the small kitchen table. While the child ate eagerly, Jack observed him, looking for clues about his identity. It was then that he noticed something he had overlooked the night before, a small wolf-shaped pendant hanging from the child's neck. "That's a nice necklace," Jack commented, pointing to the pendant. "Do you like it a lot?" The child nodded, touching the pendant with his small fingers. For a moment it seemed like he was going to speak, but then he lowered his gaze, returning to his silence. Jack was about to ask another question when the sound of a vehicle approaching was heard. Moments later, Mike Sullivan entered the cabin, followed by a middle-aged woman carrying a medical bag. "Jack, what's going on here?" Mike asked, his gaze alternating between the ranger and the child. "It's a long story, Mike," Jack replied. "But first, let's let the doctor examine the child." The doctor, who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Johnson, approached the little one with a kind smile. "Hello, sweetie. I'm Dr. Sarah. Will you let me check you to make sure you're okay?" The child looked at Jack as if seeking his approval. When the ranger nodded encouragingly, the little one allowed the doctor to examine him. Meanwhile, Jack took Mike aside and told him everything that had happened the night before, the discovery of the child, the presence of the protective wolf, and the fight with the other wolf. "This is Incredible, Mike muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. And you have no idea how the child got there? Jack shook his head. I don't even know his name. He hasn't said a word since I found him. At that moment, Dr. Sarah approached them. Physically, the child is fine, she reported. He has some minor scratches and bruises, probably from his time in the forest, but nothing serious. However, I'm concerned about his emotional state. The mutism could be a result of the trauma he suffered. What should we do? Jack asked, feeling a growing concern for the little one. For now, the most important thing is for him to feel safe and cared for, the doctor replied. We need to contact social services and the police to try to locate his family. Mike nodded. I'll take care of that. Jack, can you stay with the child while we sort this out? Jack looked at the little one, who was now sitting on the couch, hugging his knees and looking out the window with a melancholic expression. He felt an inexplicable connection with the child, a deep desire to protect and care for him. Of course, he replied without hesitation. I'll stay with him as long as necessary. As Mike and the doctor prepared to leave, Jack approached the child and sat down beside him. Everything's going to be okay, little one, he said softly. I promise you. The child looked at him, and for the first time since he had found him, Jack saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Without warning, the little one curled up against him, seeking comfort. Jack wrapped his arms around him, feeling a mixture of tenderness and determination. At that moment, a movement at the edge of the forest caught his attention. There, half hidden among the trees, was the wolf. Its eyes met Jack's, and the ranger was certain that the animal was there to make sure the child was safe. As the sun rose in the sky, bathing the cabin in its golden light, Jack knew that his life had changed forever. He didn't know what challenges awaited him, but he was determined to unravel the mystery surrounding this nameless child and protect him at all costs. What he didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a story that would intertwine destinies, reveal long-held secrets, and test the true meaning of love and family. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity at Yellowstone National Park. The news of the mysterious child found in the forest had spread quickly, attracting the attention of authorities and local media. However, for Jack Thompson, the world seemed to have narrowed down to the small cabin where he was caring for the nameless child. Despite the efforts of the police and social services, no clues had been found about the little one's identity or his family. The child, whom Jack had started to affectionately call Wolfie because of the pendant he wore, still wasn't speaking. Nevertheless, little by little, he was beginning to open up to Jack in other ways. One morning, as Jack was preparing breakfast, he heard a sound that left him paralyzed. A child's laugh, clear and joyful. He turned to see Wolfie playing with Rex, the park's guard dog. The child was petting the animal with a radiant smile, the first Jack had seen since he found him. I see you've made a new friend, Jack said, approaching carefully so as not to break the moment. Wolfie looked at him, and although he didn't speak, his smile grew even wider. That small interaction was like a ray of hope for Jack. Perhaps with time and patience, the child could overcome his trauma and speak again. Determined to help in that process, Jack began to involve Wolfie in his daily routines in the park. He taught him the names of trees and plants, showed him animal tracks, and explained the importance of caring for nature. Although the child didn't respond verbally, his eyes shone with curiosity and understanding. One afternoon, as they were walking along a trail near the cabin, Wolfie suddenly stopped, pulling on Jack's hand. He pointed insistently towards some bushes. What's wrong, Wolfie? Jack asked, intrigued by the child's reaction. To his surprise, the wolf that had protected Wolfie that night emerged from the vegetation. The animal approached cautiously, its eyes fixed on the child. Jack held his breath, ready to protect the little one if necessary. But his fears dissipated when he saw Wolfie extend his hand towards the wolf without any fear. The wolf sniffed the child's hand and then gently licked it, causing Wolfie to giggle. Jack watched the scene, marveling at the special bond between the child and the animal. Looks like you have a very special guardian, Wolfie, Jack murmured, crouching next to the child. The wolf observed them for a moment longer before silently retreating into the forest. Wolfie followed it with his gaze, an expression of longing on his face. That night, as he tucked Wolfie in to sleep, Jack noticed that the child was clutching his wolf pendant tightly. An idea began to form in his mind. You know, Wolfie, he said softly, That wolf reminds me of someone I met a long time ago. It was just a cub when I found it." And so, Jack began to tell the story of how he had rescued the wolf years ago, when it was an orphaned cub. He talked about how he had secretly cared for it, feeding it and healing its wounds until it was strong enough to return to the forest. As he spoke, he noticed that Wolfie was listening intently, his large, curious eyes fixed on him. For the first time, the child seemed truly interested in something beyond his own silent world. "Since then, I sometimes see it in the forest," Jack continued. "It's as if it's still looking after me, just like it now looks after you." At the end of the story, Jack saw something that filled his heart with hope. Wolfie had extended his small hand and placed it on his, as if he wanted to communicate that he understood, that he felt connected to that story. That night, as Jack reflected on the day's events, he realized that he was forming a deep bond with Wolfie. He was no longer just a child who needed help. He was becoming someone important to him, someone he wanted to protect and care for. However, Jack's happiness was tinged with worry. He knew that at any moment the authorities could find Wolfie's family or decide to take him to an orphanage. The idea of separating from the child caused him a pain he hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, a young woman with sad eyes was looking at a photograph of a small child. Her hands trembled as she caressed the image. "Soon, my love," she whispered. "Soon we'll be together again." Back at the park, Jack woke up in the middle of the night to a noise. He quickly got up and went to Wolfie's room, only to find the bed empty. With his heart racing, he ran out of the cabin. There, under the moonlight, he saw Wolfie standing at the edge of the forest. The child was motionless, staring into the darkness between the trees. Jack approached cautiously, afraid of startling the little one. "Wolfie, what are you doing out here?" he asked softly. The child turned to him, and for the first time since he had found him, he spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words were clear. "Mom, we'll come." Jack was left breathless, surprised both by hearing the child's voice and by the meaning of his words. Did Wolfie remember something about his past? Did he know something about his mother? Before he could ask more questions, a distant howl resonated in the forest. Wolfie turned again towards the trees, as if expecting to see someone or something appear. Jack took the child in his arms, feeling a mix of emotions. Relief at having found Wolfie, joy at having heard him speak, and a growing unease at the mystery that seemed to deepen with each passing day. As they returned to the cabin, Jack couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the forest held, and what surprises the future held for him and Wolfie. The only thing he knew for certain was that, no matter what happened, he would protect this child with all his strength. The wind whispered through the trees, as if nature itself was witness to Jack's silent promise. In the darkness of the forest, a pair of bright eyes watched them walk away, vigilant and protective. The news that Wolfie had spoken spread quickly through the small community of Yellowstone National Park. For Jack, those two words, "Mom will come," had become a beacon of hope and at the same time a source of anxiety. What did they really mean? Did the child remember more than he was letting on? One morning, as Jack was preparing breakfast, he heard his phone ring. It was Mike Sullivan, his supervisor. "Jack, we have news," Mike said, his voice tinged with a mixture of excitement and concern. "I've been reviewing the security camera footage from the night you found Wolfie. I think you should come see this." With his heart racing, Jack looked at Wolfie, who was playing quietly with some wooden blocks on the living room floor. "I'll be there in half an hour," he replied, hanging up the phone. After leaving Wolfie in the care of Emma, a kind neighbor who had grown fond of the child, Jack headed to the park's central office. There, Mike was waiting for him with a grave expression. "Look at this," Mike said, pointing to a computer screen. The grainy images from a security camera showed an old car stopping near the park fence. A young woman got out of the vehicle, holding something in her arms. It was Wolfie. The woman, whose face was partially hidden by the darkness, kissed the child on the forehead before carefully placing him on the ground. Then, with visible anguish, she returned to the car and quickly drove away. Jack watched the scene in silence, feeling a mixture of emotions. On one hand, this confirmed that Wolfie had been intentionally abandoned. On the other, the woman's evident distress suggested that it hadn't been an easy decision. "Have you been able to identify the woman or the vehicle?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mike shook his head. The license plate isn't visible, and the image quality doesn't allow us to identify the woman. But there's something else, Jack. Look at this. He forwarded the video a few minutes. On the screen, the wolf was seen approaching the sleeping child, carefully sniffing him before lying down beside him, as if protecting him. Incredible, Jack murmured. It's as if the wolf had been waiting, as if it knew the child would be there. This raises more questions than answers, Mike said, rubbing his chin. What led that woman to abandon the child here, of all places? And what connection does Wolfie have with that wolf? Jack remained silent, his mind spinning with possibilities. Then he remembered something. The pendant, he said suddenly. Wolfie has a wolf-shaped pendant. Maybe his mother knew about the wolf somehow. Maybe she thought he would be protected here. Mike looked at him skeptically. That sounds quite far-fetched, Jack. But given the situation, I suppose we can't rule anything out. As he returned to the cabin, Jack couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The pain on Wolfie's mother's face, the mysterious connection with the wolf, the child's words. Everything seemed to be part of a puzzle, whose pieces still didn't fit together. Upon arriving, he found Wolfie sitting on the porch, looking towards the forest with a thoughtful expression that seemed too mature for his age. Emma was beside him, knitting quietly. He's been like this all morning, Emma said as Jack approached. It's as if he's waiting for something, or someone. Jack sat down next to the child. Wolfie, he said softly, what are you thinking about? The child looked at him, his large brown eyes full of an emotion that Jack couldn't decipher. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to speak again, but then he simply turned his gaze back to the forest. That night, as Jack tucked Wolfie in to sleep, he noticed that the child was clutching his wolf pendant tightly. An idea began to form in his mind. Wolfie, he said cautiously, would you like to tell me about your mum? The child looked at him intently for a long moment. Then, to Jack's surprise, he slowly nodded. She sang, Wolfie said, his voice barely a whisper. She sang about wolves and forests. Jack felt his heart race. It was the longest phrase Wolfie had said since he found him. Do you remember the song? He asked gently. Wolfie closed his eyes as if trying to remember. Then, in a low and slightly trembling voice, he began to hum a melody. It was a lullaby, sweet and melancholic, that spoke of a guardian wolf protecting a child in the forest. As he listened, Jack felt a lump form in his throat. The song seemed to confirm his suspicions. Somehow Wolfie's mother had known about the wolf, had trusted that it would protect her son. That's a very beautiful song, Wolfie, Jack said when the child finished. Your mum must love you very much. Wolfie nodded, his eyes full of tears. She said she would come back, he murmured before closing his eyes and falling asleep. Jack sat beside the child's bed for a long while, gently stroking his hair. His mind was spinning with new questions. Why had Wolfie's mother left him? Did she really plan to come back? And if so, what would that mean for the bond he had formed with the child? Meanwhile, in a small town on the outskirts of the park, a young woman looked out the window of her modest apartment. In her hands, she held a crumpled photograph of a small child smiling next to a large grey wolf. A tear rolled down her cheek as she whispered, "Soon, my love. Soon we'll be together again. I just need a little more time." Back at the cabin, Jack finally went to sleep. His restless dreams filled with images of wolves, forests, and a mysterious woman singing a lullaby. Outside, under the moonlight, a furry grey figure moved silently among the trees, watching over the cabin where the ranger and the child slept, a silent guardian in the night. Days at Yellowstone National Park passed with a mixture of routine and expectation. Jack had found a rhythm with Wolfie, alternating his duties as a ranger with caring for the child. However, the feeling that something big was about to happen never left his mind. One morning, as Jack and Wolfie were having breakfast, someone knocked on the cabin door. It was Lisa Carter, the social worker assigned to Wolfie's case. "Good morning, Jack," Lisa greeted with a tense smile. "I need to talk to you. In private." Jack felt a knot in his stomach. He looked at Wolfie, who was observing Lisa with curiosity. "Wolfie, why don't you go play with Rex in the yard while I talk to Miss Carter?" The child nodded and went out, but not before casting an inquisitive look at the adults. Once alone, Lisa pulled a folder from her briefcase. "We've been investigating Wolfie's case," she began, "and we've discovered something unusual." Jack tensed, preparing for the worst. 5 years ago, Lisa continued, there was an incident in a national park up north. A wildlife researcher, Emily Winters, was conducting a study on a wolf pack. She took her young son with her. Lisa paused as if searching for the right words. There was an accident. Emily was found unconscious at the foot of a ravine. When she woke up days later, she didn't remember anything about the accident or where her son was. An exhaustive search was conducted, but the child was never found. The worst was presumed. Jack felt like he couldn't breathe. Are you saying that Wolfie? Lisa nodded. We believe Wolfie is that child. The age matches, and there's a striking resemblance to the photos we have of him. But how is that possible? Jack asked, his mind reeling. 5 years have passed. Where has he been all this time? Lisa shook her head. We don't know for certain, but there are rumors, local stories about a wolf boy living in the forest. Most dismissed them as legends, but now... Jack jumped up, looking out the window where Wolfie was playing with Rex. The child was laughing as he ran, his behavior completely normal. It's impossible, he murmured. Wolfie shows no signs of having lived in the forest for years. He speaks, albeit little. He understands things. I know, Lisa said softly. That's why we need to do more investigations. We've contacted Emily Winters. She's on her way to see Wolfie. Jack felt a mixture of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a pang of fear at the idea of losing Wolfie. When will she arrive? Tomorrow, Lisa replied. Jack, I know you've grown fond of Wolfie, but if he turns out to be her son... I understand, Jack interrupted, though his heart rebelled against the idea. What should I tell Wolfie? Lisa reflected for a moment. For now, nothing. Let's wait and see what happens tomorrow. We don't want to confuse him more. After Lisa left, Jack spent the rest of the day distracted, observing Wolfie with new eyes. Was it possible that this sweet and seemingly normal child had survived alone in the forest for years? And if so, how to explain his current behavior? That night, as he tucked Wolfie in, the child surprised him with a question. Jack, what is a mom? Jack felt his heart tighten. A mom is someone who loves you very much, who takes care of you and protects you, he answered carefully. Wolfie seemed to reflect on this. Like you? He asked innocently. Jack had to hold back tears. Yes, like me. But it's also someone who gave you life, who carried you in her womb. And where is my mom? Wolfie asked, his big, curious eyes fixed on Jack. I don't know, Wolfie, Jack replied honestly, but maybe we'll find out soon. The next morning, Jack was nervous. He had slept little, his mind full of questions and worries. When he heard a car approaching, he felt his heart speed up. A woman in her late 30s got out of the vehicle. She had dark hair and tired eyes, but there was an intensity in her gaze that Jack immediately recognized. It was the look of someone who had suffered an unimaginable loss. I'm Emily Winters, she introduced herself, her voice trembling. Where is the child? Before Jack could answer, the cabin door opened and Wolfie came running out. He stopped short when he saw Emily, his eyes wide open. Emily let out a choked sob. Lucas, she whispered, using a name Jack had never heard. My little Lucas. To everyone's surprise, Wolfie, or Lucas, didn't back away. Instead, he took a step forward, his head tilted as if trying to remember something. Mom, he said softly, his voice full of a mixture of confusion and recognition. Emily knelt down, opening her arms. For a moment, everything was suspended. Then, as if an invisible barrier had broken, Wolfie ran towards her, burying himself in her embrace. Jack watched the scene with a mixture of emotions, joy for the reunion, sadness at the idea of losing Wolfie, and a growing curiosity about what had really happened in the last 5 years. As Emily cried and laughed, hugging her lost son, a movement at the edge of the forest caught Jack's attention. There, half hidden among the trees, was the wolf. Its intelligent eyes seemed to contain secrets that Jack was only beginning to guess. At that moment, Jack knew that Wolfie's, Lucas's story was much more complex and amazing than anyone could imagine. And something told him that this reunion was not the end of the story, but just the beginning of a new chapter full of mysteries to solve and truths to uncover. The reunion between Emily and Lucas, as they now knew Wolfie was called, had been emotional and moving. However, as the days passed, it became evident that the situation was much more complex than anyone had imagined. Lucas seemed divided between two worlds. On one hand, he responded to Emily's affection, allowing her hugs and showing flashes of recognition. On the other, he remained attached to Jack and the life he had known in the park. Often, he was found looking towards the forest with a longing expression. One afternoon, as Emily and Jack watched Lucas play with Rex in the garden, Emily broke the silence. "There's so much I don't understand," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "How did he survive all these years? Who took care of him? And most importantly, why doesn't he remember me completely?" Jack sighed. "Emily, there's something I need to show you. Maybe it will help answer some of those questions." He took Emily to the park office and showed her the security camera footage, the car stopping, the woman leaving the child, the wolf approaching. Emily watched the images in silence, her eyes filled with tears. "That woman, it's not me," she finally said. "But who is she and why did she have Lucas?" "We don't know," Jack replied. "But there's more. Lucas has a special bond with a wolf in the park, the same one that appears in these images." Emily looked at him incredulous. "A wolf? But that's—" "I know. It seems impossible," Jack interrupted. "But I've seen it with my own eyes. It's as if the wolf protects him." At that moment, a high-pitched scream broke the air. Jack and Emily looked at each other alarmed before running out towards the garden. What they saw left them breathless. Lucas was standing at the edge of the forest, laughing joyfully. Beside him, sitting calmly, was the grey wolf. "Lucas!" Emily shouted, terrified. "Get away from that animal!" But Lucas didn't seem scared at all. Instead, he put his small hand on the wolf's head, petting it as if it were a domesticated dog. "It's okay, Mom," Lucas said, his voice clearer and more confident than Jack had ever heard. "He's my friend." Emily took a step forward, but Jack gently held her back. "Wait," he said, "look." The wolf, far from showing aggression, affectionately licked Lucas's hand before looking at Emily and Jack. Its intelligent eyes seemed to be evaluating them, as if deciding whether they were a threat to the child. "Incredible," Emily whispered. "It's as if it's protecting him." "I think that's exactly what it's been doing," Jack said. "Maybe for years." Lucas approached them, the wolf walking obediently by his side. "Mom, Jack," the child said, his voice full of emotion. "This is Gray. He's been taking care of me since I got lost." Emily knelt in front of her son, trying to stay calm despite the wolf's presence. "Lucas, honey, do you remember what happened when you got lost?" The child frowned, as if straining to remember. There was a storm, and then I was alone. I was scared. But then Gray came and kept me warm. He showed me where to find berries and water." Jack and Emily exchanged looks of amazement. Was it possible that this wolf had really cared for Lucas all these years? "But Lucas," Jack asked gently, "what about the woman who brought you here? The one we saw in the video?" Lucas looked confused. "What woman?" Before they could inquire further, the wolf, Gray, suddenly raised his head, his ears pricked. A moment later, the sound of a vehicle approaching was heard. An old, battered car stopped in front of the cabin. The driver's door opened, and a young woman got out, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "Lucas," she called, her voice trembling. The child turned, his eyes widening with recognition. "Aunt Sarah!" he exclaimed. Emily stood up, protectively placing herself between Lucas and the newcomer. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want with my son?" The woman, Sarah, raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "Please, I can explain everything. My name is Sarah Bennett. I was Emily's research assistant. I was there the day of the accident." Jack felt the world stop for a moment. Here, finally, were the answers they had been looking for. But something told him that the truth would be stranger and more complicated than any of them could have imagined. As everyone looked at each other, tense and confused, the wolf, Gray, moved to stand next to Lucas, as if ready to protect him from any threat, whether human or animal. At that moment, Jack knew they were about to uncover a story that would challenge everything they believed they knew about the relationship between humans and animals, about love and loyalty, and about the invisible bonds that sometimes unite us in the most unexpected ways. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah, Emily, Jack, and Lucas sat in the cabin's living room. Gray, the wolf, had laid down near the door, his alert eyes observing every movement. Sarah, visibly nervous, began her account. It all started 5 years ago, During our research expedition, Emily and I were studying the behavior of a wolf pack in the Northern Reserve. Emily had brought Lucas with her, as she had no one to leave him with. Emily nodded, her eyes full of painful memories. I remember that. Lucas was fascinated with the wolves, Sarah continued. One day while we were following the pack, there was a terrible storm. We got separated. Emily and Lucas went in one direction, I in another. When the storm passed, I found Emily unconscious at the foot of a cliff, but Lucas had disappeared. Jack intervened. But the search teams combed the area for weeks. How is it possible they didn't find him? Sarah lowered her gaze. Because someone had already found him. You see, there's something you don't know about our study. We were investigating not just wolf behavior, but also local rumors about wolves protecting humans. Emily gasped. What? But that's impossible. That's what we thought, said Sarah. Until I saw with my own eyes a young wolf taking Lucas to its den. I couldn't believe it. I watched for days as the wolf cared for Lucas, brought him food, kept him warm. Lucas, who had been listening attentively, spoke. Gray saved me. He taught me how to survive. Sarah nodded. Yes, Lucas, that young wolf was Gray, but I was in a dilemma. I knew I should report to the authorities, but I also knew that if I did, they would separate Lucas from Gray and probably kill the wolf. So I made a difficult decision. You decided not to say anything, Jack concluded, his voice a mixture of understanding and reproach. Yes, Sarah admitted. Instead, I stayed nearby watching Lucas from a distance, making sure he was safe. Over time, I realized that Lucas wasn't just surviving, but thriving. He had formed an incredible bond with Gray and the pack. Emily, with tears in her eyes, asked, But why didn't you tell me? I thought my son was dead. Sarah lowered her head, ashamed. I'm so sorry, Emily, I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't believe me, afraid the authorities would blame me for not speaking up sooner. And as time went on, it became harder and harder to admit the truth. Jack, trying to process all this information, asked, But why did you decide to bring Lucas here to this park? Because the Northern Reserve was going to be partially developed, Sarah explained. Gray's pack's habitat was in danger. I researched and found out that this park had a wolf conservation program. I thought it would be the perfect place for Lucas and Gray. Lucas, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke. I remember you told me it was for my own good, that we would be safe here. Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, Lucas. I wanted to protect you and Gray, but when I left you here, I realized I had made another mistake. I couldn't bear the thought of abandoning you again. That's why I've come back. Emily, who had been listening with a mixture of emotions, finally spoke. I can't believe all this. My son has been alive all this time, raised by wolves. It's incredible. Jack, always practical, asked, But how do you explain that Lucas can speak and behave like a normal child? Sarah smiled weakly. That's the most amazing part. As I taught him in secret. Whenever I could, I would approach and give him lessons. Lucas is incredibly intelligent. He learned quickly. Lucas nodded enthusiastically. Yes, Aunt Sarah taught me things, and I taught her how to talk to the wolves. Everyone looked at Lucas in amazement. Emily, overcoming her initial shock, approached her son and hugged him tightly. Oh, Lucas, you've been through so much, but you're here, you're safe, it's a miracle. Jack, observing the scene, felt a mixture of emotions. Joy for the reunion of Emily and Lucas, admiration for the child's incredible story of survival and adaptation, and a pang of sadness at the idea that Lucas might leave. Gray, as if sensing the emotional turmoil in the room, approached Lucas and put his head on the child's lap. Lucas smiled and gently petted him. What happens now? Jack asked, giving voice to the question everyone had in mind. Emily looked at her son, then at Gray, and finally at Jack and Sarah. I don't know, she admitted. But what I do know is that I can't separate Lucas from Gray. They've formed a bond that goes beyond what we can understand. Sarah nodded. You're right, separating them would be cruel. Jack, seeing an opportunity, spoke. Maybe they could stay here, in the park. We could create a special research and conservation program. Lucas and Gray's story could help change the way we see the relationship between humans and animals. Lucas's eyes lit up at this idea. Can we, Mum? Can we stay here with Jack and Gray? Emily looked around at the people who had cared for and protected her son in different ways. Then she looked at Gray, the wolf that had been more than a pet to Lucas, a true guardian and friend. "I think," she finally said, "that we have a lot to plan and discuss. But yes, Lucas, I think this could be the perfect place for us." As night fell over Yellowstone National Park, a feeling of hope and possibilities filled the cabin. The story of Lucas, Gray, and the incredible bond between a boy and a wolf was far from over. In fact, it seemed that a new chapter was just beginning, one that promised to change not only their lives, but perhaps the way the world viewed the relationship between humans and nature. The following days at Yellowstone National Park were a whirlwind of activity and emotions. The news of Lucas and Gray's incredible story had spread quickly, attracting the attention of scientists, conservationists, and media from all over the country. Emily, with the help of Jack and Sarah, had begun working on a revolutionary research program. Their goal was to study and document the unique relationship between Lucas and Gray, hoping to shed light on the complex interactions between humans and wild animals. One sunny morning, as Lucas played with Gray in the garden under Emily's watchful eye, Jack approached with an expression of contained excitement. "I have news," he announced. "The National University has approved our research proposal. They'll give us funds to establish a study center here in the park." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, Jack. Did you hear that, Lucas? We'll be able to stay here and keep learning about Gray and his friends." Lucas, who had been listening attentively, jumped for joy. "Does it mean Gray can stay with us?" Jack crouched down to be at the child's level. "Yes, Lucas, Gray will be able to stay here in the park. In fact, we're going to create a special area for him and other wolves where they can live safely and we can study them without disturbing them." "Great!" Lucas exclaimed, hugging Gray. The wolf, as if understanding the conversation, affectionately licked the child's face. Sarah, who had joined the group, added, "And there's more. The Wildlife Conservation Foundation wants us to share our story. They believe it can help change people's perception of wild animals." Emily nodded, thoughtful. "It's a great responsibility. We'll have to be very careful about how we present this to the world. We don't want people to think it's safe to approach wild wolves or try to domesticate them." "You're right," Jack agreed. "Our message should be about respect and conservation, not about domestication." Lucas and Gray's relationship is unique and special. While the adults discussed the details of the new program, Lucas wandered off a bit, venturing to the edge of the forest with Gray by his side. He stopped in front of a large oak tree and placed his hand on the rough bark. "Gray," he said softly, "do you think others will understand? That they'll see how special you and your family are?" The wolf looked at Lucas with his intelligent eyes and let out a soft whimper, as if wanting to reassure the child. Suddenly, a movement in the nearby bushes caught their attention. To Lucas's surprise, another wolf emerged from the vegetation. It was smaller than Gray, probably younger. The new wolf looked at Lucas with curiosity, showing no fear or aggression. "Mom, Jack, Sarah, come see," Lucas called excitedly. The adults ran to the edge of the forest, stopping short at the scene. Gray was sitting calmly next to Lucas, while the younger wolf cautiously sniffed the child. "Incredible," Emily whispered, quickly pulling out her camera to document the moment. Jack watched in amazement. It seems Gray isn't the only wolf that trusts Lucas. This could be the beginning of something truly extraordinary. Sarah, with tears of emotion in her eyes, commented, "I always knew Lucas was special, but this exceeds all my expectations." As they watched, Lucas slowly extended his hand towards the young wolf. To everyone's surprise, the animal approached and allowed the child to gently pet it. "Her name is Luna," Lucas said with conviction. "She's Gray's younger sister." Emily looked at her son with a mixture of pride and amazement. "How do you know that, honey?" Lucas shrugged. "I just know. I can feel it, as if I could understand them." Jack and Sarah exchanged significant looks. This ability of Lucas to communicate with wolves was precisely what made his case so unique and valuable for research. "Lucas," Jack said softly, "do you think you could teach us to understand wolves like you do?" The child smiled, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Of course, but it will take time. It will. And you'll have to learn to listen not just with your ears, but also with your hearts." Emily hugged her son, overwhelmed by pride and love. "My little one, you've grown so much. You've learned things that most of us will never fully understand." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in golden and pink hues, the group remained at the edge of the forest. watching as Lucas played with Gray and Luna. It was a scene that defied everything they thought they knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Jack, looking at Emily, commented, "You know, when I found Lucas that night, I never imagined we'd be here, on the brink of a discovery that could change the way we see the natural world." Emily nodded, her eyes full of gratitude. "And to think I was close to losing all of this. Thank you, Jack, for taking care of Lucas, for believing in him, for giving us this opportunity." Sarah, who had been quiet, spoke. "I think we've all learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes miracles happen in the most unexpected places, and love and understanding can overcome any barrier, even between species." As night fell over Yellowstone National Park, a sense of hope and infinite possibilities filled the air. Lucas, Gray, and Luna played under the light of the first stars, a living symbol of what was possible when humans and nature worked in harmony. The future that lay ahead of them was full of promises and challenges, but one thing was certain: the extraordinary story of Lucas and his wolf friends was just beginning, and it had the potential to change the world in ways they couldn't yet imagine. 5 years had passed since that day when Jack found a small lost boy in the forest. Yellowstone National Park had transformed into an internationally recognized research and conservation center thanks to the extraordinary bond between Lucas and the wolves. On a sunny spring morning, the park was buzzing with activity. Scientists, conservationists, and students from all over the world had gathered for the inauguration of the new Center for Interspecies Communication Studies, a project that had been born from Lucas's surprising ability to understand and communicate with wolves. Lucas, now a 15-year-old young man, was at the center of the improvised stage in the forest clearing. By his side, Gray and Luna, the wolves that had become an integral part of his family, sat with surprising calm before the crowd. Emily, with pride shining in her eyes, stepped forward to begin the ceremony. "Welcome, everyone," she began. 5 years ago, we discovered something extraordinary here in Yellowstone. Not only did I recover my son, who I thought was lost, but the world gained a completely new perspective on the relationship between humans and animals. Jack, now the park director, continued, "What Lucas has taught us goes beyond simple communication. He has shown us that empathy, respect, and love can transcend the barriers between species." Lucas stepped forward, his presence radiating a serene confidence that went beyond his years. "What I have learned from Gray, Luna, and the pack is that the true language is that of the heart. It's not just about understanding their sounds or behavior, but about connecting with them on a deeper level." As if to demonstrate his words, Lucas made a subtle gesture. Gray and Luna got up and walked to the edge of the forest. Moments later, to the amazement of the audience, several more wolves emerged from among the trees, approaching cautiously but without fear. "These are members of Gray's pack," Lucas explained. "They have learned to trust us just as we have learned to respect them. They are not pets nor domesticated animals. They are our companions in this ecosystem, and we have much to learn from them." Sarah, now a respected researcher at the center, took the floor. "The program we are inaugurating today will not only study how wolves communicate among themselves and with Lucas, we will also explore how we can apply these principles of communication and empathy to the conservation of other species and ecosystems around the world." The audience listened attentively, fascinated by the scene before them. A young man surrounded by wild wolves, all in perfect harmony. Emily continued, "But this center is not just about research, it's also about education. We want to change the way people view wild animals, foster greater respect and understanding." Jack nodded, adding, "And beyond that, we want to inspire people to reconnect with nature. In an increasingly urbanized and technological world, it's crucial to remember our links to the natural world." Lucas made another subtle gesture, and the wolves began to retreat towards the forest. "They have given us their trust," he said, "and with it comes great responsibility, not only to protect them, but to protect their homes, their ecosystems." As he spoke, a young wolf stopped and looked back. Lucas smiled, recognizing her. "That's Nova, Luna's daughter. She was born here in the park 2 years ago. She represents the new generation, the future we're trying to secure." The ceremony continued with the traditional ribbon cutting, but what remained etched in everyone's minds was the image of Lucas and the wolves, a living testimony to what was possible when humans opened themselves to a deeper understanding of the natural world. That night, after the guests had gone and the park returned to its usual tranquility, Lucas sat on the porch of the cabin with Emily, Jack, and Sarah. "You know," Lucas said, looking towards the forest where Gray and his pack had retreated, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if things had been different, if I hadn't gotten lost in that forest 10 years ago." Emily took her son's hand. "Life has mysterious ways of taking us where we need to be, honey. Although they were difficult years, I can't help but feel that everything happened for a reason." Jack nodded. "You've changed many lives, Lucas. Not just ours, but potentially those of countless animals and ecosystems around the world." Sarah smiled, adding, "And to think it all started with a lost boy and a lone wolf. It's a reminder that the deepest connections often arise in the most unexpected places." Lucas stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed on the full moon rising above the trees. A distant howl broke the silence of the night, followed by another and another. "They're singing," Lucas said softly. "Singing to the moon, to the night, to life itself." He closed his eyes and, to the surprise and delight of the others, let out a perfect howl that joined the wolves' song. It was a sound that transcended the barriers of language and species, a sound that spoke of unity, of understanding, of a future where humans and nature could coexist in harmony. As Lucas and the wolves' song rose towards the stars, Emily, Jack, and Sarah looked at each other, their hearts full of hope and gratitude. They knew they were witnessing something truly special, the beginning of a new era of understanding and connection with the natural world. And so, under the starry sky of Yellowstone National Park, the extraordinary story of a boy and his wolf continued, promising a future where the boundaries between human and wild blurred, and where the language of the heart could unite all creatures in a symphony of life and love.